It began with the choir. Not the grand evensong kind, but the faint, half-mournful hum that drifts through a college quad at dusk, when the wind carries fragments of practice from some distant chapel. I was crossing St. Benedict's that evening, coat collar turned up against the drizzle, when the sound reached me. A soft contralto on a wrong note, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw my attention. I remember thinking, as I often do, that Oxford is full of beauty, unintentional, and errors divine. I suppose that was when the case began, though no one yet had called it that. The porter at the gate had told me nothing unusual had happened. He lied, but not with malice. It was the lie of habit, the reflex of a man whose wages depend upon the illusion of order. Inside, the air smelled of varnish and wet stone. Students hurried past with essays under their arms, eyes fixed on invisible deadlines. One of them, a girl with auburn hair and rain on her cheek, paused as if to speak, then thought better of it. Later, I would learn her name was Clara Denning. Later still, that her essay would matter more than any paper I had ever marked or neglected to read. Lewis had gone on ahead to see the bursar. I lingered beneath the cloisters, studying the notice board. A jumble of Latin mottos, concert programs, and an advert for rooms to let, academic preference. It was the handwriting that caught me. Slanted, elegant, ink slightly smudged at the tail of each word. The same hand, I would realize, that had annotated the essay we would find in her room 2 days later. But at that moment it was merely familiar, in the way an echo is familiar, a sound whose source you cannot place. When the rain strengthened, I ducked into the chapel. The choir had finished, the air held their ghost. Candles guttered on the altar. I sat, perhaps longer than necessary, and let my thoughts drift toward the old questions. The point of faith, the shape of loss, the curious persistence of music after it ends. A verger entered, nodded without speaking, and began stacking hymnals. His shoes squeaked faintly on the flagstones, a minor irritation that became rhythmic. "Morse," he said at last. "You still about? Chief Inspector Strange has been looking for you. Something about a girl gone missing." Outside again, I noticed the lamplight catching in puddles like spilled mercury. The porter was talking to a constable by the gate. I asked for the name. "Clara Denning, sir. First-year English. Stayed in Hallcroft Lane, top floor. Went out after evensong yesterday. Never came back." I thanked him, though the word felt empty, and walked the path toward the river. The Cherwell is a patient thing, slow as guilt. On its surface floated clusters of wet leaves, none willing to sink. At the boathouse, I found Lewis smoking under the awning, shoulders hunched against the mist. He said there'd been a sighting. Someone thought they'd seen a girl in a red coat near Magdalen Bridge around 9. Told him witnesses often remember color when they forget truth. He smiled. That small, weary smile of a man long resigned to my lectures, and asked whether I'd eaten. I hadn't. We walked back toward the college. I could hear the faint toll of 7 from Christchurch Tower, each note dissolving before the next began. Somewhere a door slammed, somewhere a bicycle chain rasped. Ordinary sounds, but together they formed a rhythm too deliberate to ignore. I have always believed that cities, like people, reveal themselves through their noises. Oxford hums in minor keys. As we reached the quadrangle, I stopped. On the stone steps leading to the library lay a single page, rain-spotted, its ink bleeding into illegibility. I bent to retrieve it. A fragment of an essay. A quotation from Donne, misquoted. Love's constancy described as reason's craft, not reason's crafty end. Only one word altered, yet the meaning turned inward, private. Someone had known their poets, but not their conscience. Lewis said it was probably nothing. I folded the page and slipped it into my pocket. I told him he was right, and of course he wasn't. The choir began again somewhere far off, a rising chord that trembled on the edge of dissonance. I remember thinking that every investigation begins with sound. A wrong note, a word misplaced, a silence too careful to be natural. By the time we reached my car, the rain had steadied into its rhythm. I turned the key, and Marla filled the cabin like a confession. Lewis stared out the window, his breath fogging the glass. I said quietly that the tune we'd heard, the one drifting over the quad, had faltered not from error, but from hesitation. He asked what I meant. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but someone in St. Benedict's had sung off-key on purpose. That, I suppose, was the beginning. There are moments in a case when the tangible world begins to dissolve, when paper, ink, and handwriting become more alive than the people who made them. That was the sensation that accompanied my first visit to Clara Denning's room. It was small, narrow, and littered with drafts. Each sheet trembled faintly under the breeze from the half-open window, as though the dead girl were still correcting them from some invisible distance. Lewis stood awkwardly by the door, afraid to step on anything that might later be declared evidence. Her desk held the ordinary chaos of scholarship. Essays half-marked, an open dictionary, a cheap biro chewed at the end. But in the center, as deliberate as a signature, lay a wine-stained draft. I saw immediately that it wasn't merely a student's work. The margins were too considered, the rhythm of her sentences too mature for her age. And the title, The Essay That Broke His Heart, was written twice, as if she'd tested the phrase and approved of its irony. Lewis asked what I thought it meant. I said it sounded like a confession disguised as criticism, and he frowned in the way he does when I make things unnecessarily complicated. I picked up the top sheet and noticed a faint indentation beneath a paragraph on Donne's metaphysical conceits. Someone had written a word there, pressed hard enough for the nib to score the page below. I shaded it lightly with the side of my pencil. The letters emerged slowly. Again. It was such a small word, and yet it held the weight of recurrence. The idea of something repeated, unwilling to die. I slipped the paper into an envelope before Lewis could see it. We spoke to her tutor, Dr. Evan March, a man who had perfected the art of tired distinction. His room smelled of port and forgotten flowers. He gestured to a chair, but didn't wait for me to sit before talking. Clara was gifted, he said, perhaps too sensitive for the academic world. When I asked about the missing essay, his eyes wandered to the window and stayed there. He supposed it might turn up in one of her drawers, though he doubted it. The phrasing bothered me. He supposed, though he doubted. The conjunction was wrong. People who genuinely hope for recovery don't arrange words like that. They either hope or they despair. They don't bind both with polite grammar. As he spoke, I scanned the shelves. A volume of Donne's poems, spine cracked at The Ecstasy. A slim monograph by a certain Julian Tressel, a name that rang faintly from a faculty list, and then, on the desk, a half-empty glass of red. The stain on Clara's draft had been the same color. I filed it away not as proof, but as tone. Crimes, like symphonies, are conducted in key signatures. Afterward, Lewis and I walked back through the quadrangle. He thought March harmless, just another overworked Don entangled with a student's misplaced affections. I said affection was rarely misplaced, only misread. He gave me that look again, the one between patience and pity. Back at the station, I examined the photocopy of the draft. The misquotation of Don still annoyed me. Reason's craft instead of reason's crafty end. A tiny difference, but deliberate, like the indentation I had found. I took out my crossword, hoping for distraction. The clue read, Heartbroken Scholar Revises Endless Essay. 6. The answer came at once. Repeat, the same word that hid beneath her handwriting. That evening I sat in the car outside her college, watching the light die behind stained glass. I thought about repetition, of mistakes, of loves, of lies told to spare another's dignity. The paper trail was not merely paper. It was a map of human frailty pressed into cellulose. Somewhere among those pages lay the trace of someone who couldn't let go. Lewis tapped on the window and asked if I'd found anything worth pursuing. I told him perhaps not yet, but the truth was simpler. I had already found enough to make me uneasy. Too many of the same hands, the same habits, the same color of wine, patterns forming in ink before blood ever enters the story. I started the engine, letting the radio fill the silence. Mahler again. The slow movement, always slower than I remember. As the rain began to streak the windshield, I thought of Clara's essay, of how she'd written again into the page as if she foresaw the loop we were all condemned to walk. It was, I realized, less a clue than a lament. And yet, somewhere between the smudge of wine and the error of a poet, the truth had already begun to write itself. It was one of those Oxford mornings that look clearer than they are, the kind that pretend at freshness while the air tastes faintly of damp chalk and fatigue. I had slept little. The college bells seemed to mock the idea of rest, each note rehearsing the inevitability of another unanswered question. Clara Denning was dead, her essay missing, and the man who might have explained either had cancelled a lecture and fled to London. Julian Tressel. The name had the weight of pretension about it, as if its bearer had chosen it deliberately from a shelf of better possibilities. Lewis and I arrived at his lodgings just before noon. The porter, when pressed, described Tressel as polite enough but fond of silence. A curious phrase. Silence, as though it were a vice one could be fond of. His rooms were bare except for the debris of intellect. A stack of poetry volumes, a cold teapot, and a concert program folded neatly beside an empty wine glass. I could smell the residue of something floral. Lilies, perhaps, though none were visible. Lewis opened a drawer and found an envelope addressed but unposted. Inside was nothing, as though the words had been written and then withdrawn at the last moment. I pocketed it, not for evidence, but for curiosity's sake. Absence, I have learned, can be more informative than presence. The lecture Tressel had cancelled was titled Moral Irony in the Metaphysicals, a title as overwrought as the man himself, I suspected. I sat in his chair and looked at the desk. There were ink blots like small constellations, a letter opener shaped like a quill, and an open volume of Dawn. The page bore a familiar line. Love's mysteries in souls do grow. Clara had underlined the same phrase in her essay draft. Not a coincidence, surely. I noted the edition's publisher and the date. 17th printing, University Press, 1972. The same as the copy found in her room. Lewis asked if I thought they'd been lovers. I said love was too imprecise a word. What binds two minds can be devotion or plagiarism. The symptoms are identical until the moment of revelation. He grimaced and muttered something about philosophers. On the desk was a crossword folded in half. Several clues filled, most of them wrong. I noticed one left blank. Broken vow in Oxford Chapel. 7. The answer, of course, was regrets. But Tressel had written nothing. Perhaps he disliked the word, perhaps he had too many of them. Later that afternoon we visited the hall where he was meant to lecture. The janitor said no one had bothered to cancel officially, so he'd lit the fire anyway. I stood by the hearth, watching the soot tremble in the draught. On the lectern lay the attendance sheet, unmarked, and beside it a small brown stain that looked like ink but smelt faintly of wine. I thought of Clara again, her essay stained the same way. Lewis noticed my pause. Wine again, he said. Oxford runs on it, I replied. We walked back along High Street. Students brushed past, absorbed in their own petty catastrophes, deadlines, crushes, futures. None of them knew that somewhere beneath this cobbled civility ran a quiet river of deceit, as cold and constant as the Cherwell itself. In the evening, I sat alone in my flat and turned the day over like a page that refused to end. I poured a small measure of whiskey and set the unopened envelope beside my crossword. I told myself it was too early for conclusions, too late for innocence. The radio played a recording of Mahler's Adagietto, slow enough to remind me that beauty and grief are often the same composition heard from different rooms. The phrase from Clara's essay returned. The essay that broke his heart. Perhaps she had meant it literally. Perhaps Tressel's heart had broken long before hers stopped beating. I thought about the empty lecture hall, the glass, the wrong answers in the crossword, and the faint scent of lilies. Everything pointed toward a man rehearsing his absence before the performance. At some point, I found myself writing her name in the margin of the newspaper, tracing each letter as though it might reveal the symmetry she had lost. The ink bled slightly into the paper, forming a shadow around every curve. When I looked again, it resembled a question mark. Lewis called to report that Tressel had checked into a hotel near Paddington but left before dawn. He took nothing but a suitcase and a single folder. I told Lewis to find out what color the suitcase was, though I couldn't say why. I poured another whiskey, listened to the rain begin against the window, and decided that sometimes a lecture doesn't fail because it's cancelled. It fails because the truth it meant to teach was already known and unbearable. The day had begun in that colorless Oxford way, neither wet nor dry, neither light nor dark, merely suspended in its own indecision. I had intended to spend the morning rereading Clara's notes, but something in Dr. March's voice the previous afternoon had lodged itself under the skin. Politeness strained through guilt is a distinct sound. I've heard it too often to mistake it. So I returned to St. Benedict's before lunch, without telling Lewis. March's rooms were upstairs in the north wing, where the corridors smell of polish and pipe smoke, and the faint bitterness of academic failure. He opened the door with a look that confused irritation with courtesy. I told him I needed only a few minutes, though both of us knew that brevity is rarely a virtue in police work. His study was overfurnished, shelves collapsing under the weight of commentary on poets who never wrote for readers, a dying fern on the sill, a chessboard left mid-game. The queen had been toppled, though whether by accident or design I couldn't tell. He gestured for me to sit. I declined, preferring to wander among his books. The spines told their own story, Donne, Marvell, Herbert, men whose intellects disguised their longings. A mirror of March himself, perhaps. He asked, without looking at me, whether I'd found anything new. I told him the essay still troubled me. He replied that everything about youth troubled him, especially its conviction that feeling deeply is the same as thinking clearly. His smile afterwards was the kind a man rehearses in front of a mirror to make certain it still works. When I asked about Clara's visits to the widow, Mrs. Vane, he hesitated only a second too long. She was lonely, he said. Clara had a compassionate nature. He said compassionate as though it were a flaw. I asked if he had ever visited the widow himself. He said once, out of courtesy. His hands folded, then unfolded. I noticed a faint smear of ink along the side of his thumb, fresh enough to mark the cuff of his shirt. It told me he'd been writing that morning, though there was no paper on the desk. I left him to his solitude and crossed to the adjoining garden, where the first magnolias were beginning to open. The widow's cottage stood at the far end, whitewashed and modest. She answered my knock with an expression that mingled curiosity and fatigue. Mrs. Vane was younger than I'd imagined, the kind of woman who had learned restraint through necessity rather than nature. She invited me in. The sitting room was arranged as though grief required symmetry. Twin armchairs, identical lamps, a vase of tulips dividing the room like a moral question. We spoke quietly. She admitted that Clara came often, sometimes in tears, sometimes with wine. The girl, she said, had discovered something she could neither forget nor confess. I asked if that something involved love. The widow's eyes lingered on a photograph atop the mantelpiece. A man in academic robes, presumably her late husband. She said nothing, which was answer enough. She offered tea, and I accepted. The tray rattled faintly as she poured. I asked if she remembered the last thing Clara had said to her. She thought for a long while, stirring sugar into my cup without asking whether I wanted it. "Only this," she said at last, "that truth was never written where others could read it." Then she smiled, and I realized she wasn't quoting Clara at all. She was quoting herself. On the way out, I noticed a framed document in the hallway, a faculty letter of commendation to Dr. Evan March, dated 7 years earlier, signed by her husband. So that was the connection. The tutor and the widow bound not by chance, but by gratitude, perhaps by guilt. As I walked back through the quad, I thought about the chessboard, the ink on his hand, the symmetry of her room. Some partnerships end when one heart stops, others when one begins beating again. Lewis met me by the gate. He asked what I'd found. Only that Clara had chosen her confidants poorly, I said. He frowned, waiting for the rest, but there wasn't any. Not yet. That evening, in my flat, I opened my crossword. The clue read, "Bereaved scholar hides confession. 5. I wrote elega and stopped. The remaining letter could have been N or C, elegan, elegak. Both almost words, both unsatisfactory. I stared until the whiskey ran dry, knowing the right answer would come only when I stopped wanting it. The widow's phrase echoed still. Truth never written where others could read it. I wondered, as the night closed in, how many of us had built our lives on that same belief, that the only honest sentences are the ones left unwritten. The photograph was discovered by accident, as most things worth discovering tend to be. Lewis had been searching through the college archives for Clara's correspondence, hoping for something tangible, perhaps a letter that explained her descent into silence, and instead he found a photograph. A formal college group taken in the gardens on one of those deceptive Oxford afternoons where everything looks eternal. He handed it to me with the slight pride of a man who has done something mildly out of his remit, but faintly noble. I took it without comment and let my eyes wander across the arrangement. The inevitable row of scholars, their smiles resigned, the sunlight bleaching their faces into near transparency. It was dated in black ink along the margin, Trinity Term 1989, and below it, in the archivist's neat hand, a list of names. March, Tressel, Vane, and to my surprise, Denning. Clara could not have been more than 12 that year. Her father, perhaps, had been a donor or a visiting lecturer. Yet there she was, slightly apart, standing at the edge of the frame, her expression unreadable. The composition was wrong. In every proper college photograph, symmetry is a religion. Someone had deliberately placed her outside the line. I asked the archivist whether the image had been reproduced. He shook his head. Then he said something that snagged the mind. Funny thing about that one, it was misfiled for years, wrong date on the sleeve. Should have been marked 1991, not 89. I asked how he knew. The man smiled, a little shyly, and pointed at the trees in the background. The magnolia hadn't been planted until 90. Archivists are the last true detectives left in Oxford. I studied the faces again. Dr. March in the center, his eyes too confident for humility. Tressel at his shoulder, already looking elsewhere, and Eleanor Vane, the widow, half turned away, her expression caught between memory and self-preservation. If photographs are ghosts, this one was crowded. Later that day, I visited the Bodleian, ostensibly to check a reference in Clara's bibliography, but really to think. The library was nearly empty. Rain whispered against the high windows. I took the photograph from my coat and laid it on the table beside her essay draft. The two papers looked related. Same faint water ripple along the edges. The same fine dusting of age. Something small and persistent tugged at me. I drew the page closer, compared the handwriting of the essay's marginalia to the caption on the photo sleeve. The letters had the same habit of leaning inward, as if seeking privacy. March's hand, undoubtedly. He had written the wrong year, not a clerk's mistake, but his own. Lewis joined me later, smelling faintly of wet wool and impatience. He asked whether I believed the photograph meant anything. I said it meant everything, but I wasn't yet sure in what language. He muttered about my fondness for riddles. The deduction, when it came, arrived not through logic, but through rhythm. My pencil tapped unconsciously on the table, and I noticed the spacing between the figures in the photograph. The same measured interval as the acrostic Clara had built into her essay, draft EVANM. 5 letters, 5 spaces. I traced them one by one from left to right. Clara stood beneath the M. I didn't tell Lewis. Some things are too brittle for daylight. At closing time, the librarian switched off the lamps one by one, until only the halo of my desk remained. I slipped the photograph back into its sleeve, but the image stayed with me. The girl's small figure at the margin, the widow's averted eyes, the tutor's immaculate poise. A composition of guilt arranged for posterity. On the walk home, the streets glistened, each cobblestone reflecting the faint shimmer of sodium light. I thought about time and its curious editing. How a wrong date, a misplaced face, a single word altered in a poem could realign an entire life's meaning. When I reached my flat, I poured a whiskey and unfolded the photograph once more. The magnolia in the background, the one the archivist had mentioned, leaned at a peculiar angle, almost as though a branch had been cropped out. And for the first time, I noticed what hung from it. A dark shape, blurred, indistinct, possibly nothing at all. But it drew the eye, insistently, like a forgotten thought returning at the edge of sleep. I placed the photograph face down and let the glass rest against it, as if one weight might balance the other. Outside, the rain resumed its quiet sermon. In the distance, a clock struck 9, its echo folding into the night, unhurried, unrepentant. Latin has always irritated me. Not the language itself, its bones are sound enough, but the reverence it commands among men who prefer the echo of meaning to meaning itself. That thought accompanied me as I sat once more in the dim hush of St. Benedict's Chapel, reading a letter that had turned the investigation, at least momentarily, into farce. The letter had arrived that morning, posted locally, unsigned but written in a deliberate hand. It claimed to be from Clara Denning, a confession of sorts. She wrote that her death had been her own decision, driven by guilt and an affair with Dr. Julian Tressel. The ink was faint, the tone theatrical. Lewis believed it, or half did. I did not. What betrayed it first was a small thing, the Latin motto scrawled beneath the signature, per amorem veritas, truth through love. The phrase had the right gravity, but the wrong grammar. The proper form, as any don worth his salary would know, is per amorem ad veritatem. The preposition ad, toward, had been dropped, leaving the motto adrift. A scholar like Clara would not have made that omission. Someone had meant for me to find it plausible, not correct. I folded the page carefully and slipped it into the inner pocket of my coat. The choir was rehearsing somewhere behind the organ screen. Their voices came thin through the woodwork, weaving vowels older than the stones themselves. Oxford loves to remind us that belief and artifice share the same vocabulary. When I left the chapel, the quadrangle was wet and reflective, each step sounding louder than it should. Lewis was waiting under the cloister, coat collar turned up. He told me the college warden hoped we'd consider the matter closed. A suicide, a note, a tidy tragedy. I said the warden mistook symmetry for truth. Lewis smiled faintly, which in his language meant exasperation. We went together to the senior common room. March was there, reading the Times, his posture unconvincingly casual. He greeted us with weary civility. I mentioned the letter. He nodded too quickly. When I asked whether he recognized the handwriting, he said that grief had made him forgetful of such details. But his fingers betrayed him. They rested on the table edge, tapping a pattern. Short, long, the rhythm of the college motto carved above the door, Veritas temporis filia. Truth is the daughter of time. He was thinking in Latin, though he spoke in English. Eleanor Vane entered soon after, the widow with eyes the color of extinguished light. She looked at the letter briefly, then away. She said Clara had once shown her a similar motto, though in another context. When I asked what context, she only said, "A woman's vanity, Inspector. You wouldn't understand." That night I spread the letter, Clara's essay draft, and the photograph from the archive across my table. The air smelled of old paper and whiskey. I tried to find the thread. Each clue pointed elsewhere, a set of mirrors arranged to confuse. The Latin errors, the coded acrostic in her essay, the misdated photograph, all spoke of intellect misused, precision gone astray. Oxford's native language. The deduction arrived quietly, as they often do. I recalled the widow's phrasing, a woman's vanity. The motto wasn't Clara's mistake at all, it was Eleanor Vane's. Her late husband had published under the same corrupted phrase. A personal emblem, not an academic one. The forged letter had been written by someone who knew him well enough to repeat his error. I looked again at the handwriting. March's, yes, but written under influence, perhaps dictated. The kind of deception born not from cunning but from fear. The rain began again, steady as a metronome. I listened to it for a long time, the way one listens to an unresolved chord. Lewis would later call this chapter of the case the detour, the period when we chased ghosts instead of men. He wasn't wrong. Yet I have always believed that red herrings have their own honesty. They reveal what the truth wishes to hide. Before sleep, I opened my crossword. The clue read, "Dead language conceals living truth. 5. I stared at it, pencil resting idle. The answer was obvious, but I refused to write it down. Some words, like some deaths, are best left uninflected. The room smelled faintly of damp tobacco and chalk dust. The scent of a man who reads more than he lives. I remember standing in Dr. March's study that evening, the rain clinging to my coat like guilt, and feeling that peculiar stillness which settles just before a confession. He had asked to see me privately. There was something he wished to say, he'd written. Something final. He sat by the window, a silhouette cut out against the street lamp beyond the glass. His hands were clasped too tightly, the way men hold themselves when they've already rehearsed the words they are about to betray. I waited. In these moments, silence is often the most merciful interrogation. He began haltingly, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. He spoke of Clara, of her intelligence, her loneliness, her emotional turbulence, as he called it. He spoke, too, of her fascination with him, as if the direction of affection could ever be so one-sided. I listened without interruption. When he paused to pour whiskey, I declined. His hands were shaking and the glass spilled over. At last, he said it, that he had seen Clara on the night she died, that she had come to his rooms distraught, threatening to expose some indiscretion concerning his late wife. He implied it was about Trestle, about something buried in departmental politics, but his eyes gave him away. They darted not toward guilt, but toward fear. The kind of fear that knows the truth but refuses to meet its reflection. When I asked what Clara wanted from him, he hesitated. Forgiveness, perhaps, or acknowledgement, or both. Then he said something stranger. That she'd come not as an accuser, but as a mirror, reflecting back all the small deceptions he had built his life upon. That was when I knew he was lying. True confession never dresses itself in metaphor. He stopped speaking abruptly and handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a short note addressed to the coroner, stating his culpability in matters relating to Miss Denning's death. No detail, no explanation, only that familiar phrase from the essay. The heart, once broken, is reason's end. It was Clara's line, not his. I told him it wasn't a confession. It was a quotation, borrowed from the dead. He didn't answer. I left him then, with the rain beating harder against the window and the faint smell of his whiskey burning the air. Outside, Lewis was waiting by the gate, collar up, face unreadable. He asked whether the man had confessed. I said he had tried, and that trying was often the cruelest form of deceit. Lewis frowned. He never liked my riddles. We walked together toward the quad. The stones shone with that melancholy sheen they take after rain, as though reflecting not light, but memory. Somewhere a piano was playing from an upstairs room. Slow, uncertain, like someone practicing emotion rather than feeling it. Back at the station, I laid March's letter on my desk and read it again under the lamplight. The handwriting was neat, precise, the same hand that had misquoted Don in Clara's essay margin. I thought again of the photograph in the archive, of the wrong date, the misplaced girl, the magnolia tree. Mistakes that weren't mistakes at all, but signals. The pattern was beginning to show itself, faint but insistent, like a watermark under heat. Lewis returned with a report from the warden. March's late wife had been the college librarian before Eleanor Vane took over. Her death, officially ruled an accident, had involved an overdose of sleeping pills. The connection deepened, but clarity did not. I said nothing, though the idea took root quietly. That Clara's discovery had not been about plagiarism or academic betrayal, but about resurrection of an old sin newly exposed. That night I couldn't sleep. I poured myself a measure and sat by the window, watching Oxford dissolve into its nocturnal disguise. I kept hearing March's words. She came as a mirror. I wondered whose face he had really seen reflected there, Clara's, his wife's, or his own. Just before dawn, I opened my crossword. The clue read, "False confession conceals truth within." 7. I smiled tiredly. The answer came too easily. Motive. But I left the squares empty. Words, after all, only mean what guilt allows them to. It was a Sunday morning, that deceptive stillness between bell and sermon when Oxford pretends it is innocent. I remember the smell of coffee in the quadrangle, the slow drip of rain from the cloister gutters, and the peculiar relief that comes when one believes the truth has been caught at last. Julian Tressel had been found. Not in flight, as I had expected, but in his rooms, his suitcase unpacked, a confession rehearsed yet unspoken. The warden had called, full of solemn triumph. The case, it seemed, had reached its end. The college could breathe again. Lewis and I went to question him. Tressel looked composed, almost resigned, the pallor of a man who has waited for judgment and grown weary of it. He admitted seeing Clara on the evening of her death. He admitted arguing with her, raising his voice, even grabbing her arm. He said she had threatened to expose him for plagiarizing her essay. He spoke softly, as though the truth might shatter if handled roughly. He said he had left her by the river, still alive. It was all very plausible, the neat geometry of guilt. The head of college was visibly relieved, the newspapers content. Yet as I listened to Tressel's carefully shaped remorse, I felt the unease that always accompanies an answer too eager to be believed. When I asked about the essay itself, he faltered. He said Clara had taken the only copy with her. Then, after a pause, he corrected himself. There might have been a draft in his desk. That correction betrayed him, not through deceit, but through precision. The guilty cling to error. The innocent cling to revision. Lewis thought it done. He said the man's manner was convincing. I told him conviction was rarely proof. He looked at me the way he does when he knows I'm about to complicate things that could have been simple. That night, I sat with the file open beside a dying lamp. I read Tressel's statement again. Certain sentences rang wrong. He described Clara's essay as a confession written in metaphors of love, yet he had never seen the final draft. That was the first crack. The second came with a crossword. It was the Times, Monday's edition, the one found folded in his room. One clue remained blank. Scholar misreads heart. 6. I filled it in without thinking. Reason. Then I saw it. Clara's own phrase. Reason's end. The echo wasn't accidental. He had borrowed her words, reshaped them just as he had borrowed her research. But imitation is not murder. The next morning I walked along the Cherwell, following the towpath where she was last seen. The water was calm, deceptive. The air smelled of damp reeds and cold iron. I tried to imagine Tressel here, raising his voice, losing control. It didn't fit. He was too cowardly for passion, too vain for violence. His guilt was a scholar's. Abstract, rehearsed, tidy. When I returned to the college, Lewis was waiting with news. The essay had surfaced. Not with Tressel, but among Eleanor Vane's belongings. The widow, the woman who quoted Clara's words as her own. The essay was stained with wine, the title page torn, but her fingerprints, not Clara's, smudged the corner. Lewis called it coincidence. I called it an omission. In Oxford, coincidences are simply secrets that haven't yet earned tenure. That evening, I watched the light fade across the city. Bells marked the hour without conviction. Tressel had been charged, and I was meant to feel relief. Instead, I felt the dull ache that follows a false chord. The pattern didn't hold. March, the tutor, Eleanor, the widow, Clara, the student, all bound by something older than envy, something deliberate. I poured a whiskey and stared at the crossword again. Scholar misreads heart. Perhaps the answer wasn't reason. Perhaps it was mirror, the reflection mistaken for the thing itself. Lewis would later tell me I'd been chasing ghosts that night. Maybe I was. But as I switched off the lamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that the case had resolved itself too quickly, like a door closing on the wrong room. Outside, the rain began again. Fine, ceaseless, erasing the footprints from the quad before anyone could read them. There is a particular loneliness in rereading. The words never change, but you do. That is what I told myself as I sat again with Clara Denning's essay beneath the faint pool of lamplight, the paper trembling slightly in the draught from my half-open window. The city outside was blurred with drizzle, the spires half swallowed in cloud. Oxford wears its melancholy honestly in the rain. The essay had become almost familiar now, its cadences, its small betrayals. Yet on that night, I noticed something I hadn't before. The title page, the essay that broke his heart, was dated not in Clara's handwriting, but another's. The slant of the T in the leaned left, a scholar's hand, older, steadier. March's, perhaps, or Eleanor Vane's. Both had touched this paper, and I could not yet decide which touch was the more dangerous. Lewis had gone home hours earlier. He said there was nothing more to learn from dead ink. I told him ink often speaks louder than confession. He shook his head and left. Alone, I turned to the page where Clara had written her analysis of Don's valediction. One phrase was underlined twice, interassured of the mind. I had seen it before, but its double emphasis had always felt like grief, not signal. This time I looked again. The two underlines weren't identical. One was faintly blue, the other grey. Two pens, two writers. One original, one intruder. That realization came quietly, like a curtain shifting in an unseen breeze. I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the ink lines darken under the lamplight. The second underline was March's hand. I was certain of it. The faint tremor at the curve of each letter, the same as on his resignation letter filed years ago after his wife's death. He had read the essay, annotated it, perhaps rewritten part of it. But why? The library clock struck 11. I remembered the photograph from the archive. The group of them, years earlier, and Clara standing at the margin like punctuation. I took it out and laid it beside the essay. The faint magnolia shadow in the photograph mirrored the watermark on the essay's final page, the same brand of paper used by the college printing office. I traced the watermark with my thumb. March had printed his own papers on it, the same stock his wife once ordered for departmental correspondence. It was then I noticed a faint impression on the essay's reverse side, as though something had been written atop it long after. I shaded the page lightly with pencil. The words emerged in fragments. She knows. Stop her. I sat still for a long time, listening to the sound of rain on the window pane. It could have been a trick of pressure, a coincidence. But coincidence, I've learned, is just confession without courage. I went to March's rooms the next morning. The corridor smelt of polish and loneliness. He looked smaller than I remembered, as though guilt had hollowed him. I asked whether he still read Donne. He said he'd grown weary of love poems that pretend at virtue. I told him Clara's essay had been marked twice. He said nothing, but his hand moved unconsciously toward the desk drawer. A nervous habit, perhaps, or a reflex toward concealment. I let him speak instead. He said the essay had been brilliant, too brilliant that it had frightened him, that he'd seen himself in it, his vanity, his theft, his decay. Then he smiled faintly, as though he'd confessed to nothing at all. On my way out, I glanced at the bookshelf. The space where Donne's collected works had once stood was empty. The dust left behind formed a clean rectangle, a ghost of absence. That evening, I returned to my flat and sat again at the desk. I read Clara's essay one final time. It no longer felt like analysis, but dialogue, one voice interrupting another, one truth written over the ruins of the first. The second reading had stripped away the illusion of scholarship. It was an argument, a battle between mind and memory, lover and betrayer, teacher and pupil. The rain had stopped, but the air still tasted of it. I thought of Clara's underlined phrase, interassured of the mind, a promise that thought could survive the body. Yet all that remained was handwriting fading on borrowed paper. I turned off the lamp, leaving the essay on the table where the light had been. Some words, I realized, can only be read once before they begin to erase you. It ended, as such things often do, not with revelation, but with quiet. Oxford was grey that morning, a pewter sky pressing down upon the spires, and I walked the quad as though the stones themselves were listening. The air smelt of wet paper and smoke, the scent of endings. Trestle had been released. March was gone, his rooms sealed, his resignation accepted without ceremony. And yet the truth, if one can still use that word without irony, refused to settle. I returned to my flat early that evening. The city seemed emptied of its usual clatter. I poured the last of a bottle into a chipped glass and unfolded Clara Denning's essay for what I knew would be the final time. It was torn, stained, annotated beyond recognition, a palimpsest of all our mistakes. I read aloud the line that had haunted me most. Reason's end is heart's beginning, her phrasing, not Dawn's. A correction, not an imitation. A message to the man she admired, or feared, or pitied. Perhaps to all three. There are two kinds of heartbreak, the one we cause and the one we inherit. Clara had suffered both. Lewis had called earlier in the day to say the coroners, Report would list her death as accidental. The bruising, the angle of the fall, the absence of defensive wounds, all suggested tragedy, not malice. But he didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. I studied March's handwriting in the margins. His annotations were less corrections than apologies, words crossed out as though silence might absolve him. I noticed one I had missed before, faint but deliberate, pressed into the lower corner of the final page. For her clarity, I am condemned. The confession had been there all along, written not for me, but for himself. It struck me then that Clara's essay was not about love at all. It was about authorship. Who owns an idea, a line, a life? The essay that broke his heart had done so because it mirrored him perfectly. A man brilliant enough to understand beauty and cowardly enough to falsify it. Outside, the rain began again, thin and steady, as if rehearsed. I turned on the radio. Mahler, as fate would have it. The same symphony that had played the night she vanished. The slow movement carried through the room like an apology the world had forgotten to send. Lewis arrived just past 10, uninvited but welcome in his way. He said the warden wanted closure and that the widow had left Oxford for Bath. I asked whether she had taken anything from the college. Only a few letters, he said. I nodded. Letters always survive longer than people intend. He asked me, quietly, whether I thought Clara had truly meant to die. I told him I no longer trusted intent. He looked at me for a long moment, then left without another word. When the door closed, I noticed the crossword on my table. Thursday's edition. One clue remained unsolved. Essay that exposes the heart, 5. I stared at it for several minutes before writing, in careful ink, truth. Then I crossed it out. The better answer, I realized, was wound. The whiskey was nearly gone. I refolded the essay, slipped it into its envelope, and placed it beside the photograph from the archive. March, Vane, Tressel, Denning, myself, all arranged neatly in their own disorder. Before turning off the light, I looked once more at Clara's handwriting. That delicate tilt of letters leaning toward belief. She had written her way into immortality and vanished into footnote. Oxford, I thought, had always been better at preserving ghosts than people. When I finally slept, it was with the faint echo of rain against glass and the memory of a girl's voice I had never heard but somehow knew, reciting Don from across the years, asking questions no one would ever answer. Some hearts, I think now, don't break. They simply stop pretending otherwise.